it would take 129 countries out of 193 in the UN General Assembly to adopt a resolution in the General Assembly proposing a series of amendments to the UN Charter. That's what it would take.
Welcome to the Gist on Strat News Global. I'm Surya Gangadharan. Welcome to another edition of the Gist. We are going to talk about Lebanon, UNIFIL, the issue of UN mandates for peacekeeping operations, and so on. My guest is Ambassador Asoke Mukherjee. He was our permanent representative at the United Nations. Ambassador Mukherjee, welcome. Glad to have you.
Thank you for having me on your show.
Ambassador Mukherjee, UNIFIL is under fire in Lebanon, and big question is Netanyahu says they should be withdrawn. They're on Lebanese territory, so really he has really no say on that score. But given the situation they are in, is there any purpose in keeping them there? And how do these mandates get decided? You know, it's an old Indian complaint.
Well, UNIFIL is one of the traditional peacekeeping missions. It's been there since 1976. India has been part of UNIFIL for many decades, and the Indian soldiers have served in UNIFIL with dedication and valor. The main objective for UNIFIL today is to implement the Security Council's mandate, and it is the Security Council which has deployed UNIFIL. So any issue regarding the presence of UNIFIL and the activities or lack of activities of UNIFIL have to be addressed through the Security Council. And when peacekeeping operations are deployed on the ground by the UN and its Security Council, then they follow three criteria which are common for all peacekeeping missions. One of the criteria is the consent of the host country. And in the case of UNIFIL, it means the consent of the government of Lebanon. And that's the only country that has any say as far as the stationing of the peacekeeping mission is concerned.
So, given the fact that they've been there for so many years now, more than 40 years, is there some kind of review that is made every now and then to judge whether there's any point in continuing with it?
Yes, in fact, all peacekeeping operations undergo an annual review, and that is linked with the continuation of their mandate. The review is conducted by the Security Council, and they are briefed by the UN Secretariat, which implements the mandate. There is an Under-Secretary General for peacekeeping operations. Normally, since 2006, it has been a French national who heads the UN peacekeeping operations, who does the briefing. And they do also provide space for the force commander of the peacekeeping operation to brief the Security Council. And the same process has been followed with regard to UNIFIL. I think the review was done just a few days ago.
I think August their mandate was renewed.
Yes.
So, does the discussion remain within this little closed circle? Is there any scope for anybody else to get involved?
No, the discussion is very restricted. It's within the circle, within the members of the Security Council. And even if countries who are not members of the Security Council have contributed troops, for example, in UNIFIL in Lebanon, India has contributed more than 900 troops. But they do not invite direct consultation with those countries in this review of the mandate and how the peacekeeping operation is functioning. That has been an issue which India, as the single largest troop contributor to UN peacekeeping operations, has been highlighting for several years now. Prime Minister Modi mentioned it in the UN Peacekeeping Summit held in 2015 in New York. and called on the Security Council to actually implement Article 44 of the UN Charter, which provides countries which contribute troops and who are not represented as elected members of the Security Council or as permanent members of the Security Council to have consultations on the deployment of their troops before the deployment takes place.
Mhm. Beyond that, there's no further scope for them to advise, recommend.
Not in, well, it depends on each peacekeeping operation. In my time, for example, the peacekeeping operation in South Sudan underwent a very drastic change, and
Mhm.
mandate had to be revised into a robust mandate to protect civilians because civil war had engulfed South Sudan at that time. So there was a more active and regular review of peacekeeping operations which undergo, which go into a crisis. And this 1 year requirement is only for the budget, but
Okay.
there are reviews which take place on functional requirements, and those reviews also are within the Security Council and are not open to the wider membership. Having said that, there is a body in the General Assembly, which is the Special Committee on Peacekeeping Operations, known as the C34. And there, the troop contributing countries have been able to take a more public platform to express their concerns about not only specific peacekeeping operations, but also about the overall framework in which peacekeeping operations are deployed. Because the charter does not provide for peacekeeping operations. This mechanism was innovated by Dag Hammarskjöld in the
Mhm.
1950s, and India has been part of the innovation from 1956 onwards with the deployment of armed peacekeepers. We had
Mhm.
contingents, in fact, deployed in the same region in West Asia under the UNEF. And one of the commanders of the Indian contingent in the UNEF was chosen by Dag Hammarskjöld to be the first military advisor of the UN Secretary General. His name was Major General Inder Rikhi.
Yeah.
And in
Mhm.
he spent almost a decade and more as the military advisor to both Dag Hammarskjöld and to his successor U Thant, and is widely credited for having contributed the three principal parameters of UN of effective UN peacekeeping. One, as I said, is the consent of the host country. Without that, the peacekeeping operation really cannot be effective. The
Mhm.
second is that they have to be impartial. They cannot be seen as a part of the party to the dispute or
Mhm.
opposed to the party to the dispute. And the third is, and this is very important, most people don't remember it, the use of force to defend their mandate. And Indian peacekeepers actually have led the way even in using force to defend the
Mhm.
mandate of the peacekeeping operation. In Congo, for example, where 39 Indian peacekeepers laid down their lives. One of them, Captain Gurbachan Singh Salaria, got the Paramveer
Yeah.
Chakra posthumously.
Yeah.
They died defending the UN headquarters in Elizabethville in the Congo in the 1960s. So India is very much part of these parameters and the evolution of peacekeeping. But what has changed is in the past 20 years, where peacekeeping has become a kind of band-aid response to the political crisis. And
Mhm.
there is no stomach for in the Security Council for investing in the hard diplomacy that goes into the space created by the peacekeeping operation to bring the parties to the dispute together and to ensure a sustainable political settlement. And as long as there's no sustainable political settlement, the peacekeeping operation, in a sense, is not as effective, and it cannot be there forever. I mean, that is the
Yeah.
other point.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Mhm.
and that has been pointed out. And the best example of a peacekeeping mission which was given a fixed date for its departure was in East Timor,
Mhm.
where the UN deployed a peacekeeping mission. But the country hosting the peacekeeping mission, East Timor, led by Ramos Horta, the Nobel Peace Laureate,
Yeah.
insisted that that operation should complete its job of creating the space for a political settlement within 5 years. And at the end of 5 years, the government that was in position in East Timor took over the functions of the peacekeeping operation, and the UN wound up its operation. So
Mhm.
sometimes it works, but sometimes it does not work that way.
You mentioned the word that they've been quick to send troops in for an operation in some country, but the hard slog required to make it politically work is missing. I mean, that's
Yes.
curious, isn't it? It's easier to send in troops, kind of a firefighting thing, with really
Yes.
no end in sight.
Yes, and that's as I said, it's an affliction in the UN system, which is visible for the past 25 years. It was recognized in 2005 when the UN had its 60th anniversary summit. And one outcome of that was to go in for peace building. So you will hear a
Hmm.
lot in the UN system of peace building. But actually, what peacekeepers have been doing from the very beginning is not only observing the disputed area and keeping the belligerents separate from each
Apart.
other, but also contributing to the revival of the local communities. And here,
Hmm.
countries, it depends on the profile of the peacekeepers. Countries like India have been able to play a proactive role, recognized now very widely in Africa, for example, because Indian soldiers who have basically mainly come from rural backgrounds have
Hmm.
understood that sometimes the trigger of the violence and conflict is a local village dispute. And they bring with them their own experience of how, in villages in India, local disputes relating to grazing, land use, etc., can be resolved through a council of the village. And they have taken this experience to countries like South Sudan, and with tremendous impact. So, but the Security Council does not encourage this approach. And that is the problem,
Hmm.
because they like to show that they have responded by deploying a peacekeeping operation. But after having done that, they do not invest in the hard grind of diplomacy for peace. And they, in a sense, today the UN system itself has deprioritized Chapter 6 of the UN Charter, which is the peaceful settlement of disputes.
Yeah.
And deploying peacekeepers using enforcement provisions of Chapter 7, which is use of armed force or economic sanctions, is not a sustainable way to a political settlement.
Hmm. Why is this so? Is it because there's a lack of interest, some inertia? What is it?
I think there's a big disconnect between the people who make the peacekeeping mandates and the ground realities. This is something that has been talked of in the UN, but unfortunately, the permanent five members of the UN Security Council have used their influence to avoid biting the bullet. And the latest
Hmm.
summit of the future in New York came up with a pact for the future, but they were not able to address this issue. And the issue is really that the UN and its Security Council must lead for peace. It cannot be seen as leading for war, because the UN Charter is predicated on saving succeeding generations from the scourge of war. That is the
Yeah,
opening words
yeah.
of the UN Charter. So, if you are operating under the UN Charter, or if you're operating in a UN system which is anchored in the UN Charter, then you cannot be indifferent or silent when the primary objective is of a peaceful settlement.
Hmm. Has there ever been a situation where, in a moment of crisis, it was decided to pull out UN peacekeepers from a certain location?
Not really, but since you are referring to Lebanon, I remember from the diplomatic history of peacekeeping in 1958, Lebanon complained to the Security Council that its territory had been violated by Syria,
Hmm.
and which had invaded part of Lebanese territory. And the Security Council immediately responded by deploying peacekeepers. But what happened between June 1958 and November 1958, when this incident was resolved, was that the UN Secretary General deployed a team of mediators and negotiators, including an Indian Ambassador Rajeshwar Dayal,
Mhm.
to shuttle between Lebanon and Syria to find a political solution. And in November 1958, Lebanon wrote to the Security Council that through the mediation entrusted to the Secretary General Dag Hammarskjöld, a solution had been found, and both Lebanon and Syria agreed on that solution. And the issue was taken off the agenda of the Security Council, and the
Okay.
peacekeeping mission was wound up. So within 6 months, the peacekeeping mission was deployed and wound up. That's the only example that I can remember, which, in a sense, ironically, is rooted in the history of Lebanon.
Mhm. I understand there's even a UN force on the Golan Heights. I mean,
Yes, there is a force which is hosted by Syria,
mhm.
because the Golan Heights are part of the territory of Syria. And this force has been deployed to keep Israel and Syria apart.
Apart.
Uh, and there is a demarcated zone, and Indian
Mm.
troops have served again with distinction and valor in UNDOF, which is the name of the peacekeeping operation in the Golan Heights.
Mhm. And what is the purpose is just to keep them apart, ensure that
Yes, the
Syria
purpose was
also.
yes, the purpose was to keep them apart after the 1973 war, and
Mhm.
it was an operation which both Syria and Israel have cooperated on
Mhm.
UNDOF. What has
Interesting.
changed on the
Hmm.
ground is the Syrian civil war, which brought in non-state actors, terrorist
Yeah.
groups affiliated with Al Qaeda. And the most active group in the vicinity of the Golan was the Jabhat al-Nusra, which is today part of Al Qaeda. And the
Yeah.
Jabhat al-Nusra, in fact, targeted the UN peacekeepers of UNDOF on two occasions. The first time they didn't follow up. There were some Filipino peacekeepers, and they released them. The second time, they kept 46 Fijian peacekeepers in captivity, and then bartered them in return for whatever was promised by the mediators deployed by the UN Secretary General and member states like Qatar. And these 46 UN peacekeepers were released after that. Both occasions, there was an Indian lieutenant general who was the force commander of UNDOF,
Mhm.
and he played an outstanding role in making sure that not a single UN peacekeeper was killed.
Mhm. Let's step away from Lebanon and all those little things going on there and look at this UN mission here in Kashmir, which is an observation mission. I understand we don't want it there anymore. It continues.
Well, the UN military observer group for India and Pakistan, UNMOGE, it's called,
Yeah.
was deployed as part of the ceasefire agreement between India and Pakistan of 1949.
Yeah.
Uh, if you fast forward to 1971, uh, India and Pakistan negotiated a treaty, bilateral treaty, to
Yeah.
resolve
Absolutely.
any of their disputes bilaterally. That's the Simla
Hmm.
Agreement. And in July 1972, the Simla Agreement was signed and registered with the UN under Article 102 of the UN Charter. And in my view, the bilateral treaty dated 1972 overtakes whatever decisions were taken by the UN Security Council in 1949, because
Hmm.
things have changed on the ground.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Absolutely.
therefore, India has not accepted any locus standi of UNMOGIP because of the Simla Agreement, which does not mention UNMOGIP at all.
Yeah.
On the other hand, Pakistan has continued to write a letter every year to the UN Secretary General and the UN Security Council asking for a rollover of the mandate of UNMOGIP.
Hmm.
And in the Security Council, the way they decide on matters, unless all five permanent members oppose the request of Pakistan to roll over the mandate of UNMOGIP, the
Hmm.
Pakistani request carries the mandate forward. And that is how year after year, UNMOGIP has been rolled over the mandate, and the money for UNMOGIP is debited not to the UN peacekeeping budget, but to the UN general budget. So
Hmm.
it is a very peculiar situation, and India has tolerated it, but
Hmm.
India has not cooperated with this
Hmm.
peacekeeping peacekeeping mission or observer group. In fact, in recent years, India has even withdrawn some of the free facilities which were
Yeah.
given to UNMOGIP in India, like their housing and their moving around, etc. But as long as the issue of UNMOGIP remains on the Security Council's agenda,
Hmm.
UNMOGIP cannot be removed. And to
Hmm.
remove it from the agenda, you require again the concurring votes of all the five permanent members. In fact, that is the biggest problem facing the UN today, the veto of the five
Yeah.
members. And most of us who have dealt with the UN know that the veto was never negotiated as part of the charter. It was made a precondition
Hmm.
by the five countries for the other countries to come and negotiate and discuss and adopt the charter. And the promise was given to these delegations which objected to the veto, like Australia and India, for example. They are publicly on record in the San Francisco Conference of 1945, objecting to the veto. The promise was given to make them sign the charter that in 10 years' time, the
Hmm.
veto and any other provision of the charter would be reviewed. And that's Article
Hmm.
109 of the charter. But 1955 has come and gone. Many years
Yeah.
have passed, 70
Hmm.
years soon, and no review has taken place. It's the only major treaty which has a review clause which has never been invoked. And yet
Hmm.
everybody says the UN is irrelevant, the UN is in a crisis, etc. The answer to that is to have a review conference and make the UN fit for purpose. But surprising that
Hmm.
even the Summit of the Future could not agree on a review conference, although a high-level advisory group of the UN Secretary General tabled a report in April last year recommending a charter review conference for the Security Council to be reformed. But even that input made by a very eminent group of people, including all the representatives of the five permanent members, even their recommendation was not taken on board. So you can imagine how much interest there is in the status quo, in business as usual, to the
Yeah. Yeah.
detriment of millions and millions of people across the world who are suffering because of a inefficient Security Council.
Mhm. So let me come to my last question. The whole issue of UN reform, Security Council reform and all. Obviously, it would appear to be a non starter.
No, it's not a non-starter if it is approached in the right way. In
Hmm.
any treaty, you have to have a provision which allows you to raise this issue. As I mentioned, Article 109 of the UN Charter allows this issue to be raised. The issue is that of Article 27, paragraph 3, which gives the veto power to these five countries. If you take
Hmm.
the veto power away and replace it with majority voting, there cannot be the kind of criticism of the
Yeah.
UN that there is today. Because
Hmm.
every country has to work a constituency to get itself elected
Hmm.
and to account for the decisions that it endorses in the UN. It happens in the Economic and Social Council, and every 3 years there's an election. So countries are judged by their track record of those 3 years.
Yeah.
It happens in the UN Human Rights Council, where 47 countries are elected and they take decisions and are judged by their track record. But in the Security Council, the five permanent members were never elected
Hmm.
and they are never accountable. So we have to address this point, and therefore, Security Council reform is many things beyond what I've said. But the core issue is how it decides on what is on its agenda, and it decides on the basis of the veto power, which is not part of the democratic principles on which the UN Charter operates. You look at the UN General Assembly; it's one country, one vote. If you have no
Yeah.
consensus, you have a majority vote, and
Yeah.
so too in
Absolutely.
the Economic and Social Council, and so too in the Human Rights Council. So why should the Security Council be different? And that
Hmm.
is where India has tried very hard to collect a like-minded group of countries calling for reform multilateralism. And it's a pity that the idea of reform multilateralism has been pushed down the road whereas it should have been harvested in 2025 when the UN marks its 80th anniversary.
So, what would it take for something to change? I mean, it would take a miracle, I would guess.
No, it won't take a miracle. It would take 129 countries out of 193 in the UN General Assembly to adopt a resolution in the General Assembly proposing a series of amendments to the UN Charter. That's what it
Mhm.
would take. And it's not difficult for professional diplomats who have experience of multilateralism to make this happen. I mean,
Yeah.
there's enough churn in the world. There are different regions of the world which have different sets of problems, and all of them want the charter to be responsive to their sets of problems. So
Yeah.
it's possible, and it's very much viable for a group of 129 countries to be found among the different regions of the world to converge and seek a review and reform of the charter. Between the African group of 54 countries and the Asia Pacific group of 54 countries, you already have 108. And
Yeah.
you need another, so it is possible to work on it, but you need a clear vision and you need strong political will. Without that, it can't be done.
Mm. Strong political will. Ambassador Mukherjee, thank you for your time and interesting discussion. I mean, clearly, UN reform is a huge issue, and vested interests are in the way. Hopefully, something will break. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me on your show. Thank you.
That's all we have for you on this edition of The Gist. Do subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on social media. Thank you very much. Good day.